Hey everyone, I'm Brennan Jones and welcome back to another video as I go over why I think inflation is going to explode, especially in food and energy prices. I want to talk about the difference between inflation and higher prices. Inflation, as defined by the very well-known Austrian economist Milton Friedman, is that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, in the sense that it is and can be only produced by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. You cannot get inflation without the expansion of the currency supply. So whenever a loan is made or a credit card is swiped, that money is created from nothing, chasing the same amount or even fewer goods in the real economy. We can all see the rising prices around us, and unfortunately, I don't think it's going to get better. With central banks all around the world trying to raise their interest rates to tame the consumer price inflation that their countries are experiencing, I believe that will do little to tame the higher prices of food and energy. Now, central banks can only control the demand side of every economy, not the supply side, as either raising the interest rates or lowering them only impacts the price of money. What they cannot do is tell companies to pump out more oil, produce more food, create more products and services. Now, I'm not saying central banks haven't had a part in raising the prices of everything around us, but it's mainly been in assets like stocks, bonds, cryptocurrencies, and the housing market. Now, this is one of the only times in history, if not the only time, that central banks are raising rates with the slowing of their economies. Like with the Atlanta Federal Reserve predicting that by the end of the second quarter, which is pretty much right now, we are currently in a recession. Official results will probably be around at the end of the month. So we have rising prices of inflation and a slowing economy, which is starting to translate into stagflation, what I predicted in my previous video, which, if you haven't already, please check it out. I will leave a link down in the description below for you to watch later. Now, our economies worldwide are only as good as our access to cheap and accessible energy, as energy is essentially a derivative of economic growth. The more energy we have, the more economic growth. And with it, so rises population, productivity growth, and everything else great you can think of. Before, I talked about the oil and gas industry seeing an ongoing divestment in the space, as not as much investment is being geared towards new supply coming online and also refining capabilities, as our refining capabilities in North America at least are on a steady decline and stagnating. You can pump as much oil out of the ground as you want. It's all dependent on how fast we can refine those into all the different products we use on a daily basis. And if there is no growth in our energy industry, then you can pretty much expect economic growth to decline as well. And if our energy production and consumption isn't there to match our growing economy, our growing population, I can pretty much guarantee you that both will stagnate and probably decline. We're seeing shortages of all types of fossil fuels like diesel, gasoline, urea, nitrogen fertilizers, and even plastics. And it's not just oil refining capabilities that are driving up the prices. It's also higher taxes placed on oil and gas producers in order to produce the petroleum products that we depend on. And of course, who pays for these higher prices in the end? It's you and it's me. And here's the thing, with all these higher prices in fuel and energy, it all gets trickled down back to the end consumer, where we have no choice. We have to pay these higher prices because fuel and energy are not expendable. We need those in order to survive, to heat our homes, in order to have electricity. And we're seeing energy shortages all around us globally. Like for example, with Germany and Russia, where Germany is having their natural gas imports cut off by Russia. And from these energy shortages, I believe will stem food shortages, as food is essentially a derivative of energy itself, as you need energy in order to harvest your crops, transport your food to the stores, grow the food itself, and process the food into the final products. And of course, with food, that's not expendable as well. You have no choice. You have to eat. Otherwise, well, you die. Now, I've been walking up and down the grocery aisles many times over this past year, and I have seen multiple instances where these shelves have been empty or bare. And right now the shelves are not so bad. they look a lot more stocked than they did within the past 6 months. But just because they're stocked now doesn't mean these grocery stores aren't experiencing scarcity problems with their food inventories, as right now there are multiple indicators that we are heading towards a global food crisis. Like for example with the avian influenza impacting our chicken and egg production, as millions of chickens and turkeys are having to be culled out of our food supply as they contract the virus. Or the mysteriously high amount of food processing plant fires happening within the United States and in other parts of the world, with over 25 plants being partially or even completely destroyed in the US since the start of the year. Or with the high temperatures and dry conditions, or even extreme wet conditions being felt across different parts of the globe, resulting in the deaths of thousands of livestock and disrupting the growth of crops. Or countries declaring that they will ban their exports of food, like India banning their exports of wheat in order to maintain the food security within the country, with India being the 10th largest wheat exporter in the world. Or the halting of shipments of fertilizers by rail companies, either due to the striking of employees or by the rail companies themselves. In April of 2022, Union Pacific limited fertilizer shipments to reduce rail congestion and reduce fertilizer shipments by up to 20%. Products that will be affected include nitrogen fertilizers, such as urea and urea ammonium nitrate, as well as diesel exhaust fluid, an emissions control product required for diesel trucks. And these diesel trucks need urea in order to operate, otherwise they're useless. They need urea in order to drive. And even though that news is a little bit old, is a few months old now, it couldn't have come at a worse time because they needed that fertilizer at the very beginning of the growing stage of their crops, as the fertilizing of crops takes place in the late stages of spring in order to maximize crop yields by replacing the soil's nutrients that were taken out of the ground from the previous harvest. That paired with higher prices of fertilizers, and it's causing demand destruction amongst farmers. Farmers now are switching to natural alternatives in order to grow their crops. And it's just not possible to grow as much food as we once did with natural alternatives alone. As 44% of the global population in 2000 is being fed by nitrogen fertilizers, rising to 48% in 2008. And I'm sure that's only risen since then. And of course, we can't forget how impactful the war with Russia and Ukraine is, with both countries being large exporters of food, oil and gas, fertilizers. Their reduced production will have to be made up elsewhere or not even at all. And I'm probably banking towards not even at all. And with supply being reduced globally, will translate to higher prices and even fewer food items, with central banks tightening up their currency supplies by raising rates and even going through the process of quantitative tightening into a supply crisis, will only bring down asset prices and turn our labor shortages into labor surpluses, as people look for jobs in order to make up the losses in their portfolios, where we'll go from a wealth effect where people feel wealthy and go to the opposite where people will feel like they'll have to make up for it. The raising of rates will increase the costs of servicing existing debt obligations with variable rates. I believe this will ultimately lead to foreclosures, bankruptcies, layoffs. I believe we'll see a continued rise of food and energy, the essentials, and a decrease in the prices of the non-essentials, like appliances, tools, toys, furniture, as we're starting to see a pileup of those inventories as more money is spent on essentials and less money on other non-essential items. And this brings me to what is called the bullwhip effect, as it is a supply chain phenomenon describing how small fluctuations in demand of the retail level can cause progressively larger fluctuations in demand at the wholesale, distributor, manufacturer, and raw material supplier levels. Essentially, when supply chains either ramped down their production or halted it altogether since the start of the pandemic, they had to ramp up their operations. In doing so, they had to gauge what the future demand for their products was going to look like. That paired with port congestion still lingering in our supply chain, I believe will worsen inventory pileup and will result in much lower non-essential goods prices, as retailers and suppliers will have to mark down their inventory in order to clear it as fast as they can to make room for ever increasing amounts of inventory as they start to pile up. In doing so, this will incur heavy losses for corporations alike, and ultimately will do permanent damage to the supply chain in reducing the output of goods as producers ramp down production or even completely eliminate companies entirely, which I believe will make items of all sorts become very unaffordable for people to own. All these issues paired with governments wanting to hand out money to citizens in order to fight inflation, stupid I know, right? Will only worsen prices, as the printing of money throughout history has never worked well for you and me in the middle class and the lower class, as the printing of money will only lower our standards of living, as money does not fix our problems. I think for anyone watching this video, please consider preparing for these conditions, as the rising costs of food and fuel will make our standards of living decrease and our ability to be able to afford personal property even more and more unlikely. And personally, I think it could wipe a lot of people out financially, but that's just my opinion. And as always, you guys should do your own research. Don't just listen to me, as this video is for entertainment purposes only. Now, like I said before, we might not see empty shelves in more developed countries like Canada or the US, but we could see higher prices, especially after the coming harvest that we'll see this fall from the growing season this year. Now, don't think I'm some crazy lunatic tinfoil hatter, as I am not the only person trying to warn people about the coming global food crisis, like Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, or UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, or Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, and even the President of the United States, Joe Biden.
With regard to food shortages, yes, we did talk about food shortages. And it's going to be real. The price of these sanctions is not just imposed upon Russia. It's imposed upon an awful lot of countries as well, including European countries and our country as well.
And I just want to end off this video with saying there's a difference between stockpiling and panic buying. Now, humans have stockpiled for as long as we've been around. We're grabbing a little bit of extra food at a time when you're shopping. We'll be able to ensure that your family and yourself will be fed if tough times were to occur. And I think this is completely reasonable, as you should be looking out for yours and your family's well-being while food is still plentiful. And panic buying, well, that's a different scenario. And that's my rant for today. Thank you guys for watching this video. Please stay safe out there. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.